Today is June 20th, 2018. I'm interviewing Ed Nebinger in Newtown, Connecticut. The interviewer is Caleb Pittman, working with Central Connecticut State University. Could you please state your full name and city and state in which you live?
What was it? City and state?
Yeah.
Edward M. Nebinger, and I live in New Fairfield, Connecticut.
Okay. In which war did you serve?
You know, I'm sorry, I'm going to sit a little closer.
Okay, that's fine.
Just kindly, just a little more.
In which war did you serve?
What English war?
In which war?
In which war?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you're taking this down, and this is not going well. In which world? I was in World War II and also Korea.
And what was your branch of service? Your branch of service?
USAF, well, it was Army in 1944, and then it became Air Force.
Okay.
For Korea.
What was your highest rank?
Lieutenant Colonel.
And in which general locations did you serve?
And I was in England for World War II, flying missions over Germany, and then in Korea, I was in Korea, flying.
Okay. Were you drafted or did you enlist?
Enlisted.
Okay. Where were you living at the time?
Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
Okay. And what made you want to enlist?
Well, ever since I was a little kid, I had wanted to be a fighter pilot. And when the war came along, I was just at the correct age, and the opportunity was there, so I took it.
Okay. Why did you pick this? Oh, because you wanted to be a pilot.
Yeah.
Could you tell me about your first days in the service?
My first days in the service?
Right.
Oh. Well, it's a long story. I took my training in the Southeast Training Command, where I started at Nashville, Tennessee, as a aviation cadet trainee, you know. And we took a bunch of tests there. There were all kinds of tests. There were psychological tests, psychomotor tests, crazy stuff. And they sorted us out and decided who was a good potential applicant to be a pilot or a bombardier or a navigator. And you didn't get your choice. You might think you had your choice, but they decided what you were going to be. So I was fortunate that I was selected for pilot training. And then I moved on through 4 more phases of training, which was Maxwell Field in Alabama, where we learned military procedures and beginnings of things like code and all that marching and the whole routine there. I don't want to drag this out. And then into the flying training itself, and then which had 3 phases. And I started out flying Stearman's biplanes, believe it or not. And then from there we went to Greenville, Mississippi, where I flew BT-13s, and that was kind of an intermediate stage bird with fixed landing gear, 400 horsepower. And then into Craig Field in Selma, Alabama, where I was flying AT-6s, which were advanced trainers, retractable gear, flaps, and a couple of guns. And then I graduated in December of '43 and went to another phase of training in Florida, where we checked out in the P-47 fighter down there. And from there I was shipped overseas on the, the Queen Mary, and I was with 9,000 other guys, of which a whole pack of them were fighter pilots. And I guess they expected to lose a lot of us. They didn't lose quite so many, so that's the way it was. We went initially to another training base up near Wales in England, and then I was sent to the 356 Fighter Group at Ipswich in England, which is right on the east coast at a place called Martlesham Heath. And there we had...
Just sneak it in.
That's okay. Excuse me. There we had P-47s, Republic P-47 fighters. And we had already been checked out on them, so we were supposed to hang around for a couple of more weeks and get some more training, but the balloon went up and the invasion started on June the 6th, 1944.
You can get that if you need to.
Excuse me. Hello? Hi, Ed. I was second lieutenant. And I graduated as a second lieutenant. I was 19 years old. So when I got to my squadron there, I had just turned 20. And on the night before the invasion, of course none of us knew when exactly the invasion would be, but every road in England was chock full of tanks, trucks, everything waiting to go across. So on the night before, I was talking to the maintenance officer, and he said, I just got an order to paint all the airplanes with stripes by 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
This is like in the afternoon. And I said to him, I bet tomorrow's the invasion. He said, oh, I don't know. And I said, I'll bet you £5. And I won that bet.
Yeah.
So anyway, early the next morning, and it was very early, it was still dark. Everybody was awakened, and there was lots of bombers and everything already up in the air heading out. So it was the invasion, and so we had a series of missions that went out, and I wasn't actually scheduled to go on the first day there. But what happened is we flew so many missions that they were going out, you know. So it turned out to be my first mission there. And I went out with a whole squadron of us, and we flew down, and it was overcast, I guess is the word, yeah, clouds underneath of us. But you could see the flashes through the clouds from the bombardment, the big fleet out there. So we flew over the beachhead, but you couldn't see it, and went about 50 miles south and found a hole and dropped down through the clouds and looked for stuff on the roads to strafe. And there wasn't much on the roads, a couple of small vehicles, but no armor or anything, because Hitler had it all corralled up in Holland there. He didn't want to release it because he was convinced that the invasion was going to be up there. And it was a good deception plan that we used that fooled him. But anyway, we didn't hit much except there was a flak tower we took out and a couple of things like that. But that was relatively uneventful for my first mission there. And then I proceeded to fly missions virtually every day from that point on. And the majority of our stuff was high altitude escort of the bombers, B-17s and B-24s. And then alternately we also did a lot of air-to-ground, which was targets of opportunity. You just went out and went along a rail line or a road, and anything that moved you would hit. So the P-47 was a pretty stout bird. In fact, probably the most rugged fighter ever built. And we had 8 guns, 50s, and it had quite a punch. You could knock a locomotive right off the track with one short burst, just guns alone. But we were carrying mostly 2 500-pound bombs, and sometimes we dive bomb, and sometimes we just strafe, you know. So that was pretty much that. And we went on for about 4 or 5 months with the P-47s, and then we switched over to Mustangs, P-51 Mustangs.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with Mustangs?
No, you could explain it for the...
Oh, okay. Well, North American built the Mustang, and it was a good fighter, particularly for high altitude escort. 1,550 horsepower, 6 guns, and a pretty good long range fighter. There was a lot of fighters in England of all various kinds, but we gradually switched over to Mustangs as the primary escort fighter. And it was a good airplane all the way around, although it was a little bit more vulnerable to ground fire because it had a inline V12 engine. It was called the Rolls-Royce Merlin, which was a Packard engine built by Rolls-Royce, and it was cooled by ethylene glycol. So if you took a slug in the cooler or whatever it was, you'd last about 7 minutes before when you ran out of glycol, then the engine would seize up. So that made it a little bit more vulnerable. I don't know. You tell me what you want to know. I mean,
Sure. Well, how did it all feel being in that situation?
What?
How did it feel being a pilot in that situation, in those scenarios?
I thought it was great.
Yeah.
I couldn't have been happier. It was the best job in the world. I mean, when your country's at war, if you're going to go to war, be a fighter pilot.
Mm-hmm.
That's the top of the heap.
So you really felt like you were serving your country through all that?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, I mean, so was everybody else in the country.
Yeah.
Virtually everybody was in the military then, and the good thing is that we all thought the same way. We were all on the same side. We didn't have any question about who was the enemy and who was our friends, unlike today.
Yeah.
Where we can't make up our mind what we should do.
So what did you think of your fellow officers and servicemen?
Great guys, you know. All of us very young, but happy to be where we were.
Mm-hmm.
It was a time in history that, unless you were there, you just can't visualize it. I mean, it was such a great, almost like a cinemascope.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you were on a mission and you took off and climbed up, there are already hundreds of bombers up there climbing up, going over to Germany or France or Belgium or Holland. You know, there were targets in all of those countries, and we escorted them. And it wasn't just that you tacked onto the bombers and went all the way with them because it was a long route. There was a whole lot of fighter groups in England, so one group would pick up the bomber stream and take them 100 miles or so, and then the next one would come in and relieve us. And our primary job there was to keep the German fighters from knocking the bombers down. And there was, the Germans had plenty of fighters, but they weren't really interested in getting up and mixing it up with us. You know, if they could help it, their mission was to shoot the bombers down. And they did knock a lot of them down there, you know. So when we began flying, the primary German fighter was the Messerschmitt 109, and then after a while they got Focke-Wulf FW-190s, which were better airplanes, and German pilots were good, and we had a lot of respect for them. Those guys had been fighting for years before we even got there, so I always considered that we had it pretty soft compared to those guys. If you look at a typical German fighter pilot, a lot of them started flying gliders in 1937, and I knew some guys like that after the war. And then some of them were flying in Spain, and then they were flying against the British, and then we came in there, you know. So you could say that those guys didn't just fly tour missions and go home. They flew until they were killed,
Yeah.
or until they got promoted up and became a general or something like that. And so it was a different war for them, you know. What else can I tell you?
Well, were there any casualties in your unit?
Any casualty? Of course. You know, but you didn't dwell on it. I mean, it was like you lost a few, and you know, that was part of the game.
Yeah.
I would say this, that we were lucky when we were doing air-to-ground work that we had the P-47, because it was a great air-to-ground airplane. It was the toughest airplane I've ever seen. You could clip a telephone pole off with a wing and no problem. And I've seen guys come back with hundreds of feet of wires streaming behind them. And I took a 20 millimeter strafing a German airfield and took a 20 millimeter in the left wing right in the middle, and we hit it when it hit the spar, exploded, and the bird just kept flying. Come home. So it was a rugged airplane, you know. Another guy in our unit, he had 2 cylinders shot off with a 40 millimeter P-47, you know. And the bird came back with pistons flailing, oil spewing out, and still flying. But the P-47 was had a superb engine in it. We had 2,000 horsepower, and the engine had 18 cylinders, which was 2 Pratt & Whitney 9-cylinder engines back to back. So that engine had 2,000 horsepower as base rating, but when you got into a problem where you needed more power, there's a little button on the throttle, and you hit that button and you had water injection, where it injected, believe it or not, water into your engine, and you got 600 more horsepower. Now you'll ask me, how can you get more horsepower by shooting water into an engine. Unbelievable. But what it did was, the engines that we had were very high compression engines, and so there was a lot of heat in there, and what the water did was it was atomized, and it went into the intake manifold, and it cooled the mixture. And when it cooled the mixture, it burned slower. Instead of flashing, it burned more thoroughly. So what it did is squeeze more power out of there. And so that was a great thing. It was something that the Germans didn't have, and we were fortunate to have it.
Did you sustain any injuries during your service?
I didn't. I was pretty lucky that I got hit a lot of times, but not personally. So I was lucky.
That's good. Were you awarded any medals or citations?
Well, yeah, sure. And they gave them out like pieces of fruit, you know. So.
Okay. So did you stay in touch with your family during your service?
Well, we sent letters, but not a lot. I mean, you didn't have all the conveniences you have today with, you know, iPhones and everything like that. So if you sent a letter, it went by what they call V-mail, micros, you know, and took a while to get there and took a while to get back. But and it was censored, of course, which was kind of a joke because, I mean, a lot of the censoring, it was well intended, but the Germans knew, they knew everything about us. They knew where the hell we were. They knew where our unit was located. In fact, they used to broadcast on the radio. Axis Sally would come over there and say, "And we're going to get you guys in the 356 group." We'd be sitting there around laughing at it there, you know. But, yeah.
Okay. So what did people do to entertain themselves in your unit?
Sorry.
What'd you do for entertainment?
Oh, we went into London, and there were places in there where you could dance and, you know, meet girls and things like that. I don't know how you would exactly define it. I mean, London was a big town, and I remember one time when I went in there, I was walking down the street and I saw a sign that said Myra Hess today, and I didn't know who Myra Hess was, but I walked in and she was a world famous pianist. So I watched a concert there, and I was sort of a halfway musician, played the violin, but not during the war. So.
Okay. Did you always have enough supplies?
Yeah, I would say we were very well supplied. It's hard for people today to grasp the way technology worked. You know, for us, every mission was fuel control. We were carrying a whole lot of fuel, and fuel meant range. So to give you an example, the P-47 had 305 gallons internally in the fuselage and the wings. But then on every mission we carried drop tanks, and the drop tank was either one 165 gallon tank or two 108-gallon tanks hanging under the wings there. So sometimes we'd have two 500-pound bombs under the wing and a belly tank with 165 gallons. Well, you tot that up and you've got 470 gallons of fuel. And you say that sounds like a lot of fuel, but the P-47 burned 100 gallons an hour, and when you ran the throttle wide open, it would burn 300 gallons an hour. So you had to nurse your fuel every minute that you were flying there. So what we did was we took off with always on internal fuel, and then as soon as we got climbing up, we switched to our drop tanks and tried to burn every single drop out of those drop tanks, and after we did, then we drop them. And the whole group would drop tanks at the same time, shower them all over Germany. So with the drop tanks, we could go to Berlin and back. But a lot of missions were shorter, but we didn't have a lot of trouble making it to Berlin. What you had to be careful of was that when you got in pretty deep, and then you encountered some German fighters, and you're running around in a scramble with them, that you didn't run yourself out of fuel and not be able to make it back. And we had some pretty close ones like that, where we were squeezing every drop trying to make it back over the English Channel. I talked about the immensity of it. Well, just to give you some perspective, it wasn't unusual to have 1,500 bombers flying in one day and 1,000 fighters. Now, we had, in our group, we had normal operational mode would be 48 airplanes up in the air at one time, but on a maximum effort we could get as many as 65 or something like that, you know. Each squadron normal complement was 16 airplanes, 4 flights of 4. So it was a very organized deal, you know. You took off always in pairs, one leader, one wingman, and you joined up into a finger 4, and then the 4s joined up into the squadron of 16, and we climbed up, usually up to like 30,000 feet, sometimes as high as 36,000 feet. It was always socked in England in the winter time with clouds and everything like that. So a lot of times we'd barely get in the air and we were just climbing up through solid clouds there, and you're sitting there flying on a guy's wing and looking at him, and the challenge there was not to get vertigo, because you wouldn't believe it until you do it, but if you're on a guy's wing and he makes a turn into you, he's here and you're down here and you're looking up at him, and you make a long turn like that, and then you roll out, you might think that you're like this because of your inner ear and what it does to that. So what I did was I had a technique that I developed where I would sneak a peek at my artificial horizon. I'm looking at the guy, but I'd sneak a peek at it, so I'd always know my position. The other thing was when we were climbing up, we were very close to stall because we were climbing at about 155 miles an hour with a full load on us. And when you make a turn, if you turn into your airspeed had dropped to 150, and you were only 8 miles an hour above stall. So if it got a lot of turbulence and you were horsing on a stick or something like that and you're bouncing around, you could literally spin out just climbing up. So that was one of the big things that was, it was kind of hard on the nerves, that particular aspect there. And I remember a lot of times when I was on a long climb up through the soup on somebody's wing, I'd start getting a little tense, and when you do, then you start bouncing on the stick and everything, and I learned to do two fingers on the stick so I wouldn't jiggle around so much, you know. Those are the little things, but they're very important because they kept you alive, you know. So the risks weren't necessarily all from some guy shooting at you, but it was just the little things that you had to be careful of when you were flying. We were on oxygen all the time, and there were guys that went down because their oxygen regulators froze up, and I was one that almost did that, but I caught it. But anyway, that's here and there. So I flew 69 missions, and they sent me home, and became a flight instructor for a while to the end of the war. And then I got out for 3 years, and I was recalled. I was actually enrolled in Purdue University. I was going to get an engineering degree here. I don't know why. I didn't really want to be an engineer, but I was going to go to Purdue, and they recalled me in like August of 48. And I went to Japan on the hospital ship Hope, which was an Army troop carrier then. And I got to Japan and into the base theater there, and they called out 24 names, and I was one of them, and they sent us to the Philippine Islands. So I got there, and it was a neat place, and we had P-51s again there. And you'll find this interesting since you're a political science major. Our country has a stupid history of, after every war we have to trash all the equipment. And why do we trash it? We trash it so that we don't compete with our industry for current production. So you wouldn't believe it, there was thousands of airplanes dumped in the ocean, all kinds of equipment. So I get over to my squadron, the Philippines, and we had 8 pilots in the squadron. All the rest had been let go. So here it was, 1948. Oh, the big war is over. All we're going to do is fly around in circles, you know, like that. Well, how wrong that was. Because first we had Mustangs, and then we got jets. We got the first jets, which were Lockheed F-80s, shooting stars. And it was great flying those early airplanes because it was completely different from what we'd been doing. You know, all the propeller-driven fighters were noisy, roaring in your ears. I'm partially deaf on account of that right now. And the radios were like, when somebody said that meant turn right at the next intersection. You know, like you had to learn how to interpret what he was saying. Okay. So anyway, we got the F-80s and we turned the Mustangs over to the Philippine Air Force. And that was pretty interesting because the Philippine pilots had been training, you know, checking out in the Mustangs. So on a certain day we went down to Manila and our whole group flew down and landed all our Mustangs there, and there was a grandstand and the president was there. But first we made a flyover and we put his initials, spelled his initials with the airplanes, you know. And then we parked the airplanes, and then the Philippine pilots got up on the wing and they got in and we stood there on the wing while they started the engine and everything. We jumped off and then they took off and made a flyover, so it was kind of neat, and I turned it over to them. But anyway, so I was there in the Philippines for a couple of years, and I was just getting ready to go home, and the balloon went up in Korea. North Koreans had invaded. So they said, we want to make a squadron to go up to Korea. So stupidly I stuck my hand up and volunteered. And so we had this first squadron in Korea. And it was called the Dallas Squadron. And we flew up there, and we went to Tachikawa in Japan, and they pulled a bunch of old Mustangs, back the Mustangs again, and they pulled them out of Cosmoline and, you know, put ammo in them and everything. We got in and flew them to Korea. And we went to a place called Taegu, which is about in the middle of the country there. It was like a Wild West town. The runways were all what they call pierced plank runways, metal stuff put together. And so I got there at like in the morning, and I landed and met the ops officer and everything. And he said, I don't have any place for you to sleep here, but you can. There was a bunch of tents there. And so we looked around to the tents and we found a stretcher, and I had a B4 bag with my stuff in it. I said, put it on this cot here. And he said, you want to fly a mission? I said, nah, I guess so, why not? So anyway, we jumped in the birds and for the mission, and the Reds were 60 miles away, and they were coming like hell, thousands of them, and there was very little army between them and us. We were on one side of this river there, and they were on the other river and 60 miles away. And so what we did was we fired everything we had at them. They were, a lot of them were crossing dry river beds, and they were pretty good targets there. But anyway, we fired all our ammunition at them, came back, rearmed, refueled, went out again. So I flew 3 missions the first day, and when I came back from the third one, it was getting dark and it was raining. And so I went to find that tent, and walking up and down and falling over tent ropes and all this sort of stuff, and couldn't find the tent. And I finally found this one. I said, this looks kind of familiar. So I go in there. Well, my bed's gone, but I find my B4 bag is out in the mud. So I ended up my first night sleeping in this building against a concrete wall there. So that's the agonies of war, you know. But Korea was a different thing entirely than what we'd been used to in Europe. The Koreans had a few airplanes there at our field, and I actually ended up flying about maybe 5 missions in Korean airplanes with the yin-yang insignia on the side there, and they were really beat up things that the temperature controls didn't work, and it was like 115 degrees in the cockpit. But anyway, so what happened is within a week the Reds were right across the river from us, and there was a bridge there, but it had been blown. But they had a neat little trick of making sandbag bridges, and they worked very well. What they would do is just start, it was a slow moving river, and they would start piling sandbags in, more and more and more sandbags, and then the water would flow over the top, maybe that deep there, you know, but it was still flowing. So then they could run trucks across there. So it was pretty clever, because we'd bomb those bridges and blow a hole in them, and at night they'd just build them back up. So in a little bit they were right across the river, and they were outside the field firing at us when we took off. So we had to evacuate that field, and we went to Japan, our whole group. We evacuated that place and went to Japan, and the odd thing is they never took that point. That was where they stopped there. It was like a corner like this. So for 5 months, we flew out of Ashia, Japan, and every morning we'd fly across to Ashia, Japan, and hit the Reds on the East Coast up there. And you wouldn't believe it, you know, but the North Korea has Manchuria right next to it there. And on the East Coast there was rails running right up along the sea there. And the trains were coming down from Manchuria loaded with tanks and everything, T-34 tanks and all kinds of stuff. So we were hitting trains there. We burned one train completely with napalm. And it was all T-34 tanks on flat cars. And we had, I don't know whether you know about, do you know napalm? Well, napalm is like jellied, the Greeks invented napalm. It's like jellied gasoline with jellied stuff, and you would drop it by, it was a tank full of it, and it'd fly low, and then just dropping it would make a streak of fire, maybe hundreds of feet long, and it would keep burning. Nasty stuff, because if it went on anybody, it stuck on them, like burning, what, rubber or something like that. But anyway, we napalmed the train full of T-34s, and then went up north further, and we're strafing some stuff. We came back an hour later, and the tanks had fallen to the cars onto the tracks there. I figured they were probably salvageable, because all they had to do is put new electronics and stuff like that in them there. And curiously enough, North Vietnam is in the news today a lot, but I'm probably one of the few people that ever shot a bullet north. And I strafed trains right in the heart of Pyongyang, the city itself.
Wow.
There were 2 locomotives in there, and we destroyed them both. And then they had more in a tunnel in there. But anyway, so then after that, we moved back to Korea. And we were at the very south part of Korea, at the southern tip. And we had the South Africans flying with us. They were flying Mustangs, and they had a couple of squadrons there too. Neat guys, great guys. I liked them a lot. And they used to do the Zulu war dance and stomp on the floor until they stomped the boards of the club down, stuff like that. But anyway, there we were flying missions all the way up to, the Reds had overrun most of the country by then. I don't know how much your history you know about Korea, but there was a certain point when the Reds had taken over most of the country. They've taken over Seoul and everything else, and there was a defense perimeter like this down in the south. So then MacArthur launched the invasion at Incheon on the west coast. So they invaded, came in, took Seoul, the capital of South Korea, and then were gradually pushing in to cut off the Reds. So the Reds started retreating, and they're retreating and retreating and retreating, going further north. So about this time, I was pretty well along in my flying tour of it. In every fighter squadron, you got selected to spend 30 days up in the front lines as a forward air controller. You know what a forward air controller is? Okay. Well, it was 3 jeeps. 1 jeep for me, pretty much. And then I had some GIs that were radio operators, and they had the other jeeps, and they had radios in them. And the idea is what you do is you go up in the front lines, and when the fighters come over, you point out the targets to them. You tell them, well, there's a guy over there with a tank or whatever the hell it is. And anyway, I got in this team, and the Reds were running like anything and leaving thousands of guns and ammunition boxes and everything along the sides of the road. I even picked some of it up along the way and put it in the Jeep. So we chased them all the way up to Pyongyang, North Korea. And I was sitting on the airfield at Pyongyang when my replacement came in from the squadron. And it was kind of ironic because the guy's name was Malcolm B. Edens, and he was a captain, great guy, a graduate of the great football team in the South down there, Clemson. Only he was a military guy, and he had, I guess he got an ROTC commission. But the interesting thing about Malcolm is that he had 6 fingers and 6 toes all the way around.
Wow.
Now, you say, how in hell did the guy ever get past the physical? Because when you're in the Air Force, particularly as an aviation cadet, you have to stand there naked and hold up your hands, fingers and everything. So he must have held the fingers like this. Or else he got this commission because he was in college as an ROTC and just went on to flying. But whatever it is. So Malcolm says to me, he says, how's it going, Neb? They call me Neb. I said, well, not bad. All of these guys have been running and we're chasing after them. And you know, collecting souvenirs. Now, I didn't mention to you that I was assigned as forward air controller to the 7th Korean Division, the ROK Division. And I was right in there with these guys. And if you ever wanted to see a contrast in military, that was it. Because the Korean soldier, he wore Keds or sneakers, and he had a pack with some rice, had a gun. That was about it. He walked every place. And the officers were really cruel to him. The colonel that was in charge of the regiment that I was with, I saw him sitting there on his horse and take his riding crop and beat a soldier over the head with it. And the soldier just bowed to him, you know, because that's the way it was. So, if you ever think that we had it tough in any war, the other guys had it a hell of a lot tougher. Well, anyway, to make a long story short. So there I was at the airfield at Pyongyang. And by the way, there's a poster in there that I picked up at Pyongyang. It's in the other, it's hanging on the wall. But, so my replacement came in, and he said to me, how's it going, Neb? And I said, not a piece of cake. Now, these guys are running, and all we're doing is collecting souvenirs, pretty much. So he said, okay, well, I'll see you back in the squadron. So I take my bag, and I throw it in the Jeep, and I head out. And the next day, the Chinese came in and killed that guy. Because there was 100,000 Chinese in North Korea, and they surrounded the entire 7th ROK Division and eliminated it. So it's crazy as hell, but I'm sure that when I was driving out, there was a lot of Chinese with field glasses looking at me going out there, and they didn't have a word to attack yet, you know. So I was kind of fortunate there that I didn't get nailed. So I finished the tour and went back to the Philippines. And then I proceeded to have the rest of my flying career. And no more wars. I spent, all told, about 25 years in the service. At one point I went to the Air Force test pilot school. I graduated from that, and then I was assigned as a test pilot for quite a few years. And then at another point in my career, I was sent over to Germany to the 49th Attack Fighter Wing in Spangdahlem, Germany, still as a fighter pilot. And there we were carrying nukes. And this is a little known chapter of history because most people don't know about that thing. But this was in, let's see, I went over there in 59, so in 1960 I was in Europe with the 49th Attack Fighter Wing. Okay. There were 10 fighter wings, they call them wings and not groups, in Europe and England. Okay. And most of them had F-100s. They were supersonic fighters. North American F-100 Super Sabre. And one outfit had the F-101s, McDonnell F-101s, and I believe I'm not sure whether anything. Anyway, so our mission was to carry nuclear bombs and make tactical strikes if another war started. Now we had a field in Libya. It was called Wheelus Air Force Base. And the first thing they did was send you down to Wheelus Air Force Base. We flew down there, of course, with the F-100s. And they had a great big target range out in the desert. So we used that target range to practice what they called over-the-shoulder toss. And also, before we went there, we went to bomb commander school and learned all about nuclear bombs and the safety devices and everything else, the operation of them and what have you. So you had to be a graduate of that school, and you had to have gone to the training before they assigned you to it. Now, it's very interesting that here's the F-100, a single-engine fighter, and there was a bomb hanging under that thing, was about from here to the corner long. Mm-hmm. And the missions were pretty much in, not real far in, you know, like North Korea or in East Germany and things like that. So that if war had started, we'd have been instantly scrambled and gone in and dropped these nukes. Okay. Now, how did you drop the nuke? Well, you won't believe this. But, as I say, it was called the over-the-shoulder toss. Now, what you did is, you took off, you flew as low as possible to avoid radar, usually like 100 feet or something. At exactly, not exactly, but at 360 knots, which was the best range cruise speed at low altitude. So you weren't full power or anything, but you had the nuke under the belly there. And then you'd go to a place which is called your IP, initial point. So you went straight to there. Now the initial point was usually about 10 miles from the target point, the pull, they call that the pull point. So when you hit the initial point, you turn in towards your target point, you ran the throttle up to 500 knots, and you went in there, and over your designated point, you pulled 2.5 Gs back like this. And there was a gadget in the cockpit that you'd fly going up there like that, and it was correcting for winds and everything. And that at the correct point, the bomb would release straight up. And it would go up to 11,000 feet, and it would turn around, come back, go down to a certain altitude, a parachute would deploy. Now, we never flew with the bomb, we were just trained to fly with the bomb. Yeah. Now what did you do after you dropped the bomb? Well, first of all, you put your visor down, because it was smoky glass. You put the seat all the way to the floor. So you were full throttle afterburner, and after you went like this and you just did, you went out like that, and you would be 25 miles away at about 35,000 feet when the thing went off. Mm-hmm. There. So, of course, I never did it. Never flew in it. Now we had a interesting procedure, which was that every group in Europe always had 4 pilots and 4 airplanes on alert with bombs every minute of every day. So you got selected for this duty for like 2 weeks at a time, and you lived there on the flight line. And every morning you'd go in to the intelligence officer and you get your target folder. Or maybe it was the same target folder as the previous day, you know. But what you get briefed on was the winds at the target, because they corrected for the winds and you wanted it to be on the point. And then you lived there, you ate there, you slept there, and they would have practice scrambles. So if you got a scramble, you'd rush out to your airplane. It was in a hangar with a special door that went up like this. And the crew chief, the mechanic, was there, and he had already got the engine starting, and you'd grab your chute and get into the thing. The door would go up, and if you flew, you'd be in the air within 5 minutes, probably 3 minutes. You'd be head to your target. Now, what we did was we'd start the engine and then stop the engine, cut it off, and never fly. And I'm sure, I don't know this for sure, but I think that they had air police there that if some guy had ever got rammy and decided he wanted to go, they'd have shot him. Yeah, which is good. I mean, I didn't have any problem with that. But it just goes to show you that there's 4 times 10, that's 40 nukes that would have been on their way within 5 minutes. But that was nothing compared to all the B-52s and the submarines and the silos and everything else. So there's a hell of a lot of nukes that we had poised there, and it was part of history. I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, it's...
So was that your career after military service?
Well, I had a little bit, let's see, after I came home from there, I was assigned to a headquarters for a while, and that was really my last assignment. I was really lucky because everything in my whole career was flying. Mm-hmm. You know, either as a line pilot, a flight commander, an operations officer, and this was what I considered the best jobs in the Air Force. I got to fly you know, a number of supersonic airplanes. I got to fly on the 13th Air Force Acro team. I was left wing. I got to be the solo guy at Armed Forces Day at Rome, New York. I had a 10-minute slot that FAA cleared the air over there, and it was what I liked to do.
Okay.
So, you know.
So did you join any veteran organizations after?
No, I didn't.
No.
In fact, I didn't go to a reunion for 50 years after the war. I don't know why. I just had other things going. I started this company, and I'm not one of these guys that runs around with a half a uniform. Or I think that it was a privilege to do what I did, and hell, I'd do it again. Okay. You know. But I could tell you personally that I wish some people could understand today that you don't stay a great country by being weak, you know. Mm-hmm. Or you don't have to go kicking everybody around, but I've always felt that the United States did more for everybody in the world than any country in history. And that's a fact. And when people are saying all the things they talk about, oh, we were an imperialist country, what a frickin' joke compared to other countries, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And every country that we went to, we left it in better condition than when we were. And when you think about it today, who are our best friends in the world? It's the South Koreans, the Germans, and you know, the people that, and the Italians, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and Japan,
Mm-hmm.
of course. Japan, Italy, Germany, the guys we fought, they're all some of our best friends.
Mm-hmm. So is there anything else you'd like to add before we...
What?
Is there anything else you'd like to add that we didn't talk about?
Not really. I mean, I'm sorry if I've run on too long.
No, it's okay.
But I think there's much more to, let's say, military than just fighting, or there's a whole hell of a lot to it.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of understanding things and how you got there and what the meaning of it is and all those things that, you know, you're studying Arabic. I assume you're going to seek a career in something like international relations,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. Yeah. I had a little of that. I was Air Force protocol officer for the Paris Air Show at one time there, and I almost got killed because the falling airplane came so close. But no, I don't really have anything else to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank you for your service and for being interviewed today.
Yeah, I hope I haven't bored you to death with this stuff.